Today's gospel, we hear about the rich man and Lazarus. It's very interesting to see how the people that are named in this story and those who are not. You see, having a name was very important in the ancient Israelite community, making a name for yourself. And if you had that name, then you were important. If you hadn't made a name for yourself, you weren't. So from Jesus' perspective, in this story, who has names? Lazarus and Abraham. Who are the people that don't have names? The rich man and his brothers. It's interesting. It's interesting to note that the people that the world sees as most important aren't always so. The least, those who are seen as least important from the world's perspective, they're the ones that God exalts and sees as most important. Sometimes we have a hard time looking at things from a heavenly perspective as opposed to from a worldly perspective. We have to ask God for eyes to see. And knowing names, this rich man knew Lazarus' name. Even from torments, he's calling out to Father Abraham, please send Lazarus to come and dip his finger in the water so I can have a touch from my tongue, for I'm tormented in the flames. Not sure if you've ever heard that sung before. Poor man Lazarus, sick and disabled. Put your finger in the water, come and cool my tongue, 'cause I'm tormented in flame. He had to eat crumbs from the rich man's table. Put your finger in the water, come and cool my tongue, 'cause I'm tormented in flames. It's a great song. You should listen to it on YouTube sometime. But so we look at this, and this man knew Lazarus. It's not like Lazarus was someone far away from him. It isn't even like he just didn't see him. He saw him. He knew his name. But he didn't show mercy. Lazarus longed to eat of the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. He longed for that. He was given nothing. No mercy. Jesus makes it clear in the Gospel of Matthew that we need to be merciful in order to get to heaven. He says, I was hungry and you gave me no food. I was thirsty and you gave me no drink. I was naked and you gave me no clothes. Depart from me, you accursed. We need to be merciful to get to heaven. Why is that? Because in order to get to heaven, we must be conformed to the very heart of Almighty God, and God is mercy. That's the focus of this year of mercy. The theme for it is merciful like the Father. For God is mercy. And it's not that God is saying, do this, do this, do this, so that you can fall in line and get into the right order, or, so I can make sure that you can get into heaven. He's saying this because our hearts have to be conformed to His. We have to be people of mercy. That the mercy that God pours out into our hearts and souls must then pour out to the people around us. We have to be merciful like the Father. This is important. In fact, it has eternal importance. This man was not merciful, and he ended up tormented in the flames. This is hard. And this is something I don't like to think about, because I know there are plenty of times that I'm not merciful. There are plenty of times I need to work on being more merciful. And this is part of the reason why we're doing the 1,000,000 acts of mercy. And just as an aside, you'll notice that we have 2,000 acts of mercy that you have all done. And we have excellently 2 puzzle pieces there, which you can come and check out after Mass. Both of them are red. They're just border pieces. They're not really anything exciting to look at. But it will get good eventually. Keep working on it. But why are we doing this? Well, Jesus gives us the corporal works of mercy. We see throughout the Scriptures, and Pope Francis has asked that we focus on the 7 corporal works and the 7 spiritual works of mercy throughout the course of this year. Why? Because we need to be merciful. We need to reach out beyond ourselves. So what exactly is mercy then? A lot of times we get confused and we think service is mercy. Well, mercy can be a loving service. All service isn't necessarily mercy. So, because mercy has to do with the Latin word misericordia, which comes from the word heart and misery, and it means a heart that gives itself to someone in misery. A heart that gives itself to someone in misery. Who is struggling? Who is in pain? Who is in misery? Reaching out to them. That is mercy. And it's not just acts. It's not just doing things. I could give half of my money to the food pantry and other charities like that. But if I'm doing that just to get a tax write-off, or just because I want people to see what a great guy I am, that's not an act of mercy. Has to be within the context of love. That I have to want my heart to be given away to those who are in misery, those who are struggling, uniting myself with them and helping them in their struggles. So what does this look like? How do we live out these corporal and spiritual works of mercy? Well, there are 14 of them, so I'm not going to go through all of them. You can figure out some, but I just want to kind of pull out some things you might not have thought about with some of them. So, for instance, feeding the hungry. Now, of course, this means food pantry and other things like that, and that's important. But a lot of times we don't always think about that feeding our family can be an act of mercy. Isn't necessarily, if we're just doing it because we're resentful or the like, because it's duty, that's not an act of mercy. But it can be an act of mercy. When I think about the fact that every cell in my body is there because I have been fed. And while I make some of my own food, it's not always been the case. When I was growing up, I needed my parents to make that food. Now, some of you people out there will know when children are there, the parents say there's a special ingredient in the food, and that is love, right? Any of you ever said that to your kids or your grandkids? Oh, the secret ingredient is love. That's not a thing on the side. That's important. Doing it with love, knowing that there may be no one else that can feed this person. Doing it in order to help them in their struggle, that can be an act of mercy. Not just for duty's sake. Now, clothing the naked. Of course, some of us have little children that run around and like to strip themselves of everything, and when they're really little. Well, yeah, clothing the naked, that's something that's important there too. In terms of a practical thing that all of us probably can do, have a let's clean out our closet day. Look through the things that we have that are extra, that we don't really need. Now, I'm not talking about the threadbare things, nor am I talking about the leisure suit that you have from 1972. Nobody wants that. Giving that away is not an act of mercy. Rather, to look through and say, this good article of clothing I don't need, so I'm going to give away. And you might even go further and say, here's something I do like, and I do want, and I will sacrifice for others who need it. There's a possibility, something you can do with your family. Visiting or caring for the sick. Now, of course, that has to do with people who are sick in our neighborhood or in our families, maybe going to nursing homes and hospitals, but also it can be people we don't even know. And we can even categorize maybe people who are elderly and struggling with their bodies being able to do things anymore. As you go to the grocery store, that's the word I'm looking for maybe, the grocery store, and maybe you see someone who's struggling to get something from a high shelf. Be an act of mercy. Care for the sick. To go and reach and help that out. Pull that down. That's something anyone can do. Well, most anyone. As we try to alleviate their suffering and walk with them in their struggles. Maybe holding a heavy door for someone who might be struggling with a cane or not have the strength to hold the door. An act of mercy. If some of you young people out there are saying, well, how do I live out acts of mercy? There aren't a lot of these things that I can do. I can't go to a food pantry on my own or things like that. Here's one all of us can do, especially if you have brothers and sisters. Bearing wrongs patiently. Right. I have an older sister. I have an older sister who is one of the few people in the world who knows how to really push my buttons. She doesn't do it that much nowadays, thanks be to God. But there were times we would occasionally fight. I know you're thinking, Father Vaughn, you're a model of Christian charity. I can't imagine you ever fighting. Right, Father Vaughn. You can believe whatever you want, Father Vaughn. Well, my sister and I sometimes would go at it. Let's just say that. We'd struggle. Well, there would be times that my mother would step in and say, cut it out. And then my sister would get one more quip in. Anybody know anything like that? Yeah. Well, then I'd want to go and say something, and I'd be about to say something, and my mother would say, Vaughn, quiet, cut it out. But she just did. That's not fair. Vaughn, stop it. How come she doesn't have to follow the rules and I do? Now, the fact that I kept my mouth shut was not an act of mercy. That was an act of self-preservation. It's a different thing. But we could choose to keep our mouths shut. Our mouths shut. Thank you. We could choose to keep our mouths shut when those things come up. And it's not just for the kids either. As adults, we struggle, don't we? When people say something, bearing wrongs patiently at work, amongst your co-workers or your boss. There are times that we might not do so well with this. But if we decide that I'm going to bear this wrong patiently, that can be an act of mercy. Then we get a chance to also fulfill another act of spiritual work of mercy, and that is forgiving wrongs willingly. Deacon Tom, after the last Mass, came up to me and says, Father Vaughn, I could get a puzzle piece up there every week if that's actually what those things mean. That's 1,000 acts of mercy. I guess he has to really work on keeping his mouth shut. But anyways, that's something that he has to work on. But we all struggle with that at some point in our lives, within the course of the week or the month. We all have that struggle where we have to bear wrongs patiently and forgive wrongs willingly. Praying for the living and the dead. For those that we may struggle with even. You may be looking at a particular presidential candidate, or maybe both of them, saying, I don't like them. And they need our prayer too. And that's an act of mercy. We pray for those who have died, maybe even those who have hurt us tremendously. And by praying for them, for them to be purified and enter into the presence of God. That's an act of mercy. All these different ways to help us conform our hearts, our souls, to God, that we may be merciful like the Father.